Have you ever wanted to try applique with monofilament or invisible thread, or maybe machine quilting? It can be really great. I've used it three different ways on this modern quilt: invisible machine applique with turned edges, machine quilting for interesting textures without pulling focus from the applique, and even for top stitching, my two-color flange binding. But it can also be really frustrating. You might experience thread tangling or tension issues with your bobbin thread being pulled to the top of your work, or breakage where the thread suddenly snaps. Let's unpack what might be going on so you can have more creative choices. Good monofilament thread is nothing like some of the old invisible thread. Whatever brand you prefer, good monofilament will be fine and thin and virtually disappear into your fabric, making it useful for everyone from beginner quilters to advanced quilters and fiber artists. I'm Beth Ann, and I've been successfully using various monofilament threads for decades. So let's dive into the questions that I hear most often. Oh, and I've added timestamps for the chapters so you can jump around if you're looking for something specific. First, why would you choose monofilament or invisible thread? I like to use it for invisible machine applique techniques like this, where I want a nice finished edge with a look similar to heirloom hand sewing. Especially when I'm working with lots of different colors of fabric, whether it's on a classic block like this or on Celtic style quilts like this. There's no need to keep changing thread colors just because the fabric colors change. For this Celtic style True Lover's Knot pillow, I used monofilament for machine applique, straight line or walking foot quilting in the borders, and even free motion quilting in the background. It can be very forgiving if you're learning to free motion quilt. You can create wonderful texture without worrying so much about little wobbles or accidentally crossed lines. I love it when machine quilting over panels like this, since I'd rather not have visible stitching across the mermaid. Instead, I've used long lines in the design itself as my guide and stitched right on top of them. It can be very beginner friendly, especially if you want to stitch in the ditch or seam lines between pieces and are concerned about whether or not you can keep your stitching perfectly lined up. This quilt already has a lot going on, so I've chosen to stitch in the ditch along seam lines and design lines. The stitching is virtually invisible. I also love it for detailed modern free motion quilting when I want to preserve the strong graphic impression of crisp creasing lines, but still incorporate fun details for close-up viewing. Let's consider these next two questions together. Is monofilament thread safe for quilts and for people? And how well does it hold up over time? Early monofilament sold as invisible thread really varied a lot in quality. Some of it was so strong and wiry, it felt more like fishing line. And there were legitimate concerns about it potentially sawing through the cotton fibers of a quilt over time. I had a spool like this, but I threw it away a long time ago. But modern, high quality monofilament is engineered to snap under stress so that it will break long before it damages your quilt or cuts a finger. Let me show you this again. I'm going to wrap the thread around my fingers and pull. See how easily it snaps? That's exactly what we're looking for. If you try this with a spool at home and find that the thread leaves deep red marks on your fingers and is difficult to break, I would avoid using it. This is one of the biggest fears around monofilament thread, that it will damage a quilt over time. I machine appliqued these blocks with monofilament thread, and then I quilted with monofilament thread too. You can see the difference in the textures between the unquilted centers of the blocks and the heavily quilted backgrounds. You're looking at a quilt that has been used and loved since 1998. The stitching is completely intact and the thread hasn't yellowed or damaged the fabric in any way. And this quilt has been gently washed in the washer and dried in the dryer. And while I've heard of some monofilament threads potentially yellowing or become brittle over time, I've not experienced that personally. However, I am careful to protect my quilts from long-term exposure to direct sunlight, and I never put it in the bobbin. Thread brittleness and breakage can have as much or more to do with your machine settings as with the thread itself. So, how should I set up my machine for monofilament thread? Most monofilament thread problems are actually thread delivery problems. Let's start with some of the most frustrating things that can happen. Your thread tension goes funky, the fabric puckers, or your thread jams and suddenly breaks in the middle of a stitch. This can happen when slippery monofilament thread coils off the spool, or when the spool spins a little too fast and too much thread comes off the spool. Either way, the thread can get caught on or wrapped around the spool pin. Typically, we don't notice that has happened until the thread tension goes wonky or the thread eventually breaks. And a side note, you may have noticed the thread in the photo is obviously not monofilament. I'm using it because it's a lot easier to see on camera. Avoiding abrupt starts and stops and using a felt pad next to the spool, here I have a white felt pad, as well as a spool cap, can help prevent the spool from spinning and the thread coiling off the spool. Using a thread net over the spool to keep the thread from coiling off is another quick and easy solution. Here I'm using a long thread net that I've folded back on itself to help control the monofilament thread I'm using. This will prevent the thread from coming off the spool and getting wrapped around the spool pin or jamming up my machine. Also, some spools will feed better when placed horizontally, while others do better on a vertical spool pin. If your machine comes with a horizontal spool pin, you might find an adapter like this helpful. I often find it helpful to use a thread stand to help my thread feed smoothly into the machine, especially when using a cone-shaped thread. Just position the thread over the spindle, run the thread through the hook at the top of the stand, and then thread your machine just like normal. I'm showing two different models of thread stands here, but they work exactly the same way. And again, this isn't monofilament. I picked it so that you could see it more easily. Fine threads call for smaller needles. So when it comes to needles on my domestic or home sewing machine, I prefer a top stitch needle size 7010 for machine applique, and either a top stitch 7010 or a quilting needle size 7511 for machine quilting with monofilament thread. I definitely wouldn't go any larger than an 8012. But for a long arm machine, it's usually recommended that you use a larger needle. These are the brands that I use most often, but feel free to substitute whatever brand you prefer. Do I need to adjust the tension settings? A quick reminder, modern monofilament or invisible thread is made of either nylon or polyester, and the softness and stretchiness can vary not only between the two types, but between the various brands. Personally, I found that my machines will happily sew with either nylon or polyester, but I have found when teaching in-person classes that some machines do seem to have a preference. So one of the things I suggest if someone is having issues is to swap out the type of monofilament to see if that makes a difference. But before we get to that point, one of the most effective troubleshooting tools is to try adjusting the upper thread tension. For most sewing machines, the default upper thread tension is somewhere around 4.0 to 5.0. You might have an upper thread tension dial, something like this, or you may have computerized settings like this. But with monofilament thread, that is often too much tension. It can cause the monofilament to pull the bobbin thread to the surface of the quilt. And again, I've put black thread in my bobbin to make it easier for you to see. Too much tension can also cause the monofilament to stretch and potentially become more brittle or even break. Typically, I lower the upper thread tension on my current machine to 1.5 to 2.0 when I'm using monofilament thread. But for one of my older machines, I may need to lower the upper thread tension down almost but not quite to 0. And while these settings are common, they're not universal. They're not rules. Always go by whatever settings and stitches look best on your machine, and slowing down usually helps too. Is polyester monofilament always better than nylon? Polyester monofilament, like monopoly from Superior Threads, is noted for being strong, durable, and heat resistant. It has a very fine diameter of 0.004 or zero point 0.1 millimeters, which is my preferred size. This is the monofilament thread that I use most often. It's also the easiest for me to find locally. But one of my other favorites is Orifil's monofilament, which is a lovely soft nylon that is nothing like the old nylon invisible thread. It has a diameter of 0.178 millimeters. I find it very easy to use and have always been very happy with how it's performed. I've also successfully used monofilament threads from Sew Art, YLI, and Sulky. Now, just because I didn't mention a specific brand doesn't mean it's not good. It just means I haven't tried it. A quick note here, so far I've only shown the clear options, but monofilament also comes in smoke. If you're appliquing dark fabrics like this black bias tape, you might want to switch to a smoke monofilament since the clear is more likely to catch the light when you stitch with it on a dark fabric. But I don't use smoke very often, mostly just for black stained glass effects like this. Since I was working with both light and darker fabrics here, I stuck with clear. And this little quilt dates back to 1997. And again, the thread has held up beautifully. What should I use in the bobbin? First off, I personally prefer to never use monofilament in my bobbin. For me, it's too easy for the thread to stretch a bit when winding the bobbin, which means it won't have as much stretch later and might break more easily. I also use plastic bobbins, which are not a good match with monofilament thread, as stretched monofilament has the potential to create enough pressure to pop or crack a plastic bobbin. So I avoid it completely. So what do I recommend? Well, it depends. In my own domestic or home sewing machines, I most often use a 60-weight poly such as Bottom Line from Superior Threads or an 80-weight poly such as Deco Bob from Wonderfill, and I love their pre-wound bobbins. But for years, my go-to was 60-weight 2-ply cotton from Metler, and those quilts have held up beautifully for decades too. 80-weight cotton from Orifil is worth a try as well. You can experiment to see what you and your machine like best. But let's go back to the stretch factor. Again, when teaching in person, I've observed that some machines seem to prefer a fine cotton thread versus a poly in the bobbin when using monofilament thread as a top thread. So I always recommend switching if you're running into issues. It's potentially a very easy fix. I tried it and I hated it. What are my alternatives? First off, remember that when you first stitch it out, the thread is going to be sitting up on top of the fabric where it might catch the light and may even look a little shiny. I always prefer the way the thread looks after I've washed the piece at least a time or two. The thread will sink down into the fabric and blend in much more easily. But what if monofilament just isn't your jam? No worries. Fine threads such as 100-weight micro quilter from Superior Threads or 80-weight Deco Bob from Wonderfill also work beautifully for both machine applique and machine quilting when you want the stitches to be unobtrusive. And don't be distracted by the visible needle holes here. They're just freshly stitched samples. Another quick side note, Wonderfill also makes 100-weight Invisifil, which is amazing if your machine likes it. But it's so fine that my machine has trouble detecting it, and it will keep beeping at me that the thread is broken, which is why I go with Deco Bob or Micro Quilter instead. Monofilament isn't magic, and it's not mandatory, but it can be a great tool to have in your back pocket. If you're in my Quilting Friends membership, don't forget to download your new troubleshooting checklist. It's a handy summary of what we discussed today. Happy quilting, everyone!